Hi everyone, I'm Paul.
And I'm Merv.
And we would like to welcome you to Customised Composites. We manufacture a range of carbon fibre veneers, sheets, plates, as well as a selection of carbon fibre angles, sandwich panels and other sections. In this video we are going to show you how we would use carbon fibre veneers to make a cool custom tabletop using a low cost piece of plywood. We're going to show you the steps we would take to cut and prepare the veneer, as well as glue the veneer onto the custom shape that we make, and then how we would finish it off.
We have used this technique to produce a number of new tabletops and also tidy up old ones.
This technique can also be used for cupboard doors, headlinings on boats and camper vans, dashboards, foam sandwich panels, switch panels, worktops, sliding doors, the list goes on. Hope you enjoy the video.
We have a custom shape for this desk which will be CNC cut when the carbon is in place. We're going to start off the build by setting some M6 nuts into the plywood. That will allow us to ultimately bolt the top to the legs.
On the cut wooden template, I've marked out where I want the nuts to go on the table. In this case it's 100mm in from each of the edges.
I'm going to drill out a 10mm hole which I will glue the nut into. I've drilled into the wood around 6mm so that the hole has a shoulder. I've done this using a spade bit and then opened the hole out to 6mm all the way through, which makes it slightly easier to set the nut, but to be honest it doesn't really matter if you do drill all the way through at 10mm. I'm going to use a bolt to wind the nut into the wood rather than pressing it in, so I'm covering the threads in mould release wax to prevent the bolt getting stuck. We use a thickened epoxy glue here to glue the nuts in place. If anyone would like any more information on the particular brands of epoxy that we use, please leave us a comment in the notes below. In general, they are structural epoxy glues though, or laminating resins. I'm using a bolt on the other side of the wood to pull the nut into our 10mm hole. It's nice and easy to just tighten the bolt up, but they could be pressed in anyway really until they're completely flat and flush with the surface. I've tidied up the glue and will leave the bolt in place while the epoxy sets. We've used a wooden core here as it makes finishing the edges significantly easier, but you could equally use a foam core if weight is a concern. With the glue for the nuts set, we will finish the rest of the prep work on the wooden core. Merv's given it a little sand back with a bit of sandpaper and filled the holes with plasticine that you can see in the picture in blue. That's to stop any resin getting in when we bond the whole thing together. He's now going on to finish off the edge detail on the wooden core before we cut the veneer and glue everything together. We're going to put a large radius around all of the wooden edges of the core, which will make our life slightly easier in later stages. Merv's putting the radius on using a piece of 60 grit sandpaper and a sanding block. A longboard or wood plane will do exactly the same thing. So we're now happy with the wooden core. All of the edges have been rounded off nicely and hand safed. We're going to mark out the carbon. We use and supply the veneer in 0.25 and 0.5mm thick sheets. We're going to use the 0.5mm thick veneer for the top surface and the 0.25 for the underside. We're using the two different thicknesses mainly to show the difference in cutting the veneer sheet, but also it's slightly easier to keep the 0.5mm perfectly flat on larger surfaces. Merv has finished positioning the wooden core on the veneer sheet and is now marking round it using the normal felt tip marker. Pencil would work just as well on the veneer. We're marking the sheet on the textured side and we'll be cutting it 5 to 10mm over size. And now for the scary bit of the project, cutting the actual carbon. Merv is starting with the thinner 0.25mm veneer sheet. He is literally just using a pair of normal kitchen scissors. It takes very little effort to cut this material and it is literally as simple as cutting around the shape that you've marked out. You could equally do this with a knife, but we think the scissors really are the best tool for the job. Now for the thicker 0.5mm carbon sheet that we're going to use for the top of the table. This is not as flexible as the 0.25, it's 2 layers of woven carbon as opposed to 1 layer of woven carbon, so it's twice as stiff, but it can still be cut with scissors. We've flipped the board over, making sure we cut the top and a bottom rather than two of the same, and have marked around it. Merv has switched to a slightly larger pair of scissors for the 0.5, but he can still cut through it. It's very hard to see in the video, but we did decide to drill a grid of small holes in the core all the way through it just before we glued everything together. This helps the air pockets escape and gives the excess resin somewhere to go. Here we are with our 2 carbon fibre veneer skins and wooden core ready to start gluing our tabletop together. We've cleaned the wood and the carbon with some acetone on a rag and are about to mix up our glue. We tend to brush around the edge of the part, trying to be as neat as possible, and then use a spreader card for the middle areas because it's a bit faster. The idea here is to have a nice even covering of epoxy on the carbon veneer without making too much of a mess. Oops, I've made a mess. We're using a general purpose epoxy laminating resin for this job. There are loads of different types of epoxy resin available depending upon where you are in the world. For this particular job, a laminating resin is ideal. You don't want to be using the casting or jewellery resins to glue anything down. We've put a very small amount of black pigment into our resin. This makes the finishing off of the edges of the veneer a little bit easier when the glue is set. Here we're just trying to make sure we have a nice even coverage and no large puddles. Placing the wood on top of the lower carbon veneer, we're going to repeat the same process and apply more resin to what will be the tabletop, putting a nice coat on the wood and on the veneer as well. For this job we have mixed up around 300 grams of mixed resin into 2 batches, so a total of 600 grams. That's to cover a table surface area of a little over 1 square metre. We've done all of our work here on a toughened glass table that we've already levelled, making sure it's also perfectly flat. Any curvature in our base glass here would result in a bent tabletop when everything is set, which we really hope we don't get at this point. Here we're going to use another sheet of glass on top of our table stack that will act as an intensifier plate underneath our vacuum bag. This will even out any undulations that we have in the veneer skin, hopefully pushing out all of the air, evening out the resin that is between the carbon veneers and the wood core to give us a nice flat smooth surface. We have used some 10mm foam offcuts here, which are pretty close to the finished thickness of the final tabletop. We've arranged them to support the top piece of glass where it will overhang our carbon table. With our stack made up, we're now ready to put the vacuum bag over the top. We're using a little bit of non-bondable around the edges that are close to the edge of the glass to make sure that no resin escapes out and touches the bag, and just small bits of breather to make sure we get good airflow. We do use this table regularly for laminating on, so now it has a good amount of release agent on. We use a chemical release agent for this and honey wax for things like the bolts, but we'll probably cover release agents in a separate video. We're going to glue the 2 veneers onto the wood at the same time. We have experimented a lot with the best method of keeping these veneer sheets perfectly flat. It's very easy to glue the thin veneer on with ripples in. You can sometimes get away with just weights on top if you're only gluing one side or small areas, but really vacuum is the best method with an intensifier plate. We hope to bring out a video on vacuum bagging pretty soon. Right then, the exciting part. Let's see what we've got. We always try to reuse as much of the consumables as possible. If you're careful, vacuum bags can be reused a number of times.
What do we reckon then?
Let's see what we've got. At this stage, it was pretty obvious that we had probably used a bit too much resin. We had a lot spill out, some of which unfortunately got onto our foam, which was a bit of a pain. But the tops have gone onto the wood really nicely, and to be honest, you could leave this top exactly as it is. Finish the edges, job done, which is exactly why we love using cured carbon veneer. Off the glass table, which is always a good start. If you were skinning this piece of wood to try and make a tabletop, you would now have to sand the tops and start pouring loads of resin on, sanding it off, pouring resin on, sanding it off, etc, to fill up all of the pinholes and level the surface. We don't have to do any of that. How much does carbon veneer actually add to the stiffness of the board? On our glass table we have set up 2 wooden blocks. They are spaced about 800mm apart and sit about 50mm high. So to prove that we are not using stickers and to show the difference, we have set up a basic demonstration. We have a piece of the same 9mm plywood that is used inside the tabletop. Merv weighs 75 to 80 kilos, and you can see here that with him stood on the board, there's around about a 10mm gap between the board and the table. So it's deflecting about 40mm. Okay, same spacing and the tabletop. And we have our tabletop without any edges, now cut to shape, ready to have the edges put on. We've not changed the spacing of the blocks, and you can clearly see the difference in the bend. Our tabletop is now only deflecting around 10mm at most. It would be very fair to say that the carbon has definitely strengthened and stiffened up the whole desktop. And to show the area where we had the join in the wooden core. And now back to the table build. We have the final shape cut, and Merv has just finished going around the edges, making sure that there are no loose bits of wood, but as you can see the edges are still not finished or covered with anything. At this stage we do however have a tabletop. You could just fill and paint the edges, but we prefer to use the same veneer cut into small strips stuck around the edges as the finishing touch. We are not going to try and cover the whole of the edge in one long strip, as we don't really have a piece of veneer long enough, so we're going to join the edge strips. Rather than joining them on or near the corners of the table, we're going to put the joins in the middle of every straight edge, which means we don't need a strip any longer than about 1 metre. You can see in the video that there are pieces of masking tape on the edges of the tabletop. On this we have drawn a line which is where we are aiming for the joins of our veneer to be. The main reason for joining on the straights rather than on the corners is we feel we can keep the join a lot flatter and more even along a straight edge than we can around a radius. Here we are using some thickened epoxy glue with some black pigment in to bond the edging in place. We are putting bits of battening along the straight sections to help ensure the veneer sits nice and flat and help apply a nice even pressure. We have raised the tabletop up slightly to allow us to reach under it and are obviously aiming to make sure we have all of the edge covered. You can also see that we are using quite a lot of masking tape here. Obviously a large sash clamp would be slightly easier, but most of ours are currently being used on another job. And in reality there are always some locations or situations where tape is the only option, so we thought we would show it. Again, we have left the epoxy overnight, hopefully for the last time, to set properly. And all we have to do now is sand back the slight lip that is left around the edges. Merv is using a sanding block with 180 grit wet and dry paper to very carefully take the edges down. This is a little bit time consuming, but if done carefully will leave a really nice small radius around the edge that can be polished up. We've just finished polishing the top and the sides of the table using a coarse and then a fine buffing compound to have something that looks like this. The carbon veneer really does polish up very well, and the edging went on really nicely. You can see the edge joins in the veneer, but we don't think they look bad at all, and they have come out really nice and flat. All we have to do now is make like a squirrel and find the nuts that are now set in the table to allow us to bolt the top to the desk legs. Having measured and marked where the nuts should be, I'm going to use a very small 2mm bit to hopefully find the blue tacky tape we used to fill the threads. I then open the holes out carefully using the correct size drill bit until I can get the bolts in. I did also spend some time making sure that I completely cleared out the threads. If I leave any plasticine or tacky tape or anything in the threads and tighten the bolts up, it could very easily pop the top veneer off. And now finally we are ready to assemble our desk. We've purchased a set of adjustable height desk legs from Amazon as a kit, built it up and extended it out to match our tabletop. I have also already measured and pilot drilled some holes with a 2mm bit. 2 more for the front of the desk to secure it, and 2 for the electric desk controls. To attach the top, I have already cut down some M6 bolts to the correct size, making sure that they won't lift the veneer top when I screw it down. I've also cut down some wood screws to suit as well. The legs cost us around £160. And we used about £15 of plywood as the core. We used 2 pieces of veneer, about 1 metre by 1.5 metres, which with the cost of the epoxy came to around £300, but we did have loads left over. So the whole table so far has cost us about £500, which I don't think is too bad at all. We will go on and lacquer this top, but we'll show that process in a different video. And here we have the finished table in its full glory. Thank you so much for watching our video. We hope you have enjoyed it and hope it has inspired you to take on a project of your own. Please put any questions in the comments below. Please also like our video and subscribe to our channel for more carbon fibre projects. See ya!